welcome to today's King's India Institute seminar. I'm really delighted that we have with us today Dr. Anagha Ingole from the University of Hyderabad. I might start by saying that I hope we can match the collegiality that the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad exhibits in their own seminar series here at the India Institute. So I'll start by saying a very warm welcome to Anagha, our speaker, and to our audience as well. Srilata, just a note, I can only see you at the moment on my screen. I don't know if it's the way that you're pinned. If it's for me, I'll let you have a fiddle around with that. Before we start, just to let you all know that we'll be recording today's seminar. We will begin with a presentation, followed by some discussant comments, and then we'll open out to a Q&A, which we'll try and make as participatory as possible, despite the Zoom format. But let me begin by introducing our speaker. Dr. Anagha Ingole is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Department of Political Science at the University of Hyderabad. And she joins us today to talk about her new book, Caste Panchayats and Caste Politics in India. Much of this book, I understand, was written whilst Anagha was a Fulbright-Nehru Post-Doctoral Fellow at the University of Columbia, or Columbia University. And prior to that, Anagha did her PhD in international politics at JNU. So we're really delighted to have you with us today for what I am sure is going to be a very stimulating, possibly provocative discussion on caste politics. After Anagha has spoken, my colleague Srilata Sirka, lecturer in India and Global Affairs at the India Institute at King's, will offer some initial comments, and then we'll turn to our audience. So without further ado, over to you, Anagha.
Thank you so much to Professor Louis Tillane. Thank you, Srilata and Vignesh, for asking me, for having me here. I'll jump right into the topic of today's discussion. I'll be discussing my book. I hope to speak for about 30-35 minutes, and then I'll hand over the virtual stage to Srilata. So the subject of this book is the caste panchayat, more specifically the intra-caste panchayat, or jati panchayat as it is called in India, in a lot of regions. These panchayats have been understood as caste-based justice dispensation bodies. They have come to recent attention in the national imagination for inflicting gruesome violence against couples opting for choice marriages outside of their own castes, especially women, trying to police their domestic and public lives by the use of communal force. This understanding is not at all misplaced, but is far from sufficient and is based on a limited understanding and encounter with these panchayats in the context of 20th century Indian polity, and also as an act of methodological slight in the scholarship on caste. My first encounter with these panchayats was through the caste members of these respective panchayats, meeting these members who were punished or whose membership was put at abeyance from their caste. The term which is used is ostracization. Unsettled a lot of what I thought I knew about them or had read about them. And my scholarly interest in these panchayats began with a correlation that emerged from the field. The correlation is as follows. The majority of people who were facing this loyalty enforcement from their respective caste panchayats came from castes that were beneficiaries of what has sometimes been called the second wave of political democratization. Yet, despite this democratization, that is the entry of these caste groups onto the political stage, whether it be in the form of being politically organized, being included in the affirmative action bracket, caste members having local or state level political representation, or being adept in navigating through the political bargaining processes of the modern state as a collective, the dominance of what are generally understood as primordial bodies, such as caste panchayats, over group members seemed pervasive. The correlation, of course, refuted the modernist assumption that the entry of caste into modern politics would completely dissolve the conservative aspects of caste. My concern is the aspect of loyalty enforcement by social or physical coercion, but it also led me to ask certain questions about the way the study of caste and the debates that have structured it have sort of blinded us to some important insights that caste panchayats may hold, and I argue that they do hold, for the way caste has come to shape and has been shaped by India's political modernity. Another way of asking this question is whether caste conservatism was something that was contingently present as a primitive sociological element of caste, despite or along with along with parallel but independent deepening of political democracy, or the two were in fact related. My project in this book has been to argue that it is the latter that is true. I have argued that the present strain of loyalty enforcement by caste panchayats is related to the current political democratization in a specific manner. And my task has been to show how this relation works and how the scholarly understanding of caste in politics has made this relation visible. So let me begin by underlining that even in the present context, the caste panchayats do perform many more functions that use equally enforced and cruel methods, such as, say, caste ostracization. And a large part of these functions are political functions. And this is what I'm going to concern myself with. By political functions, I mean groups trying to shape their political behavior for group-based access to welfare schemes, or in drawing up on group identity to accrue benefits of affirmative action to their respective castes. So before I chart into this any further, let me say why I think it is productive to look at the caste panchayat in this temporally and sort of conceptually expansive way. Firstly, I think it gives an explanation of why these bodies have a social sanction despite being extrajudicial bodies, and they're working often contradicting with the aspirations of the young in the community. More consequentially, the power of social ostracization or social boycott that these caste panchayats hold has something very significant to offer to us to understand the political life of caste in India. This is because of its connection to the ritualistic aspects of caste from where ostracization originates, and the way it has been used to regulate not just the social but also political control. This was done by the higher castes and the pre-modern political authorities in the past, and now the power largely lies in the hands of the intra-caste male elites. Secondly, I think this kind of a study exposes a conceptual move that was made in the 1960s and 70s when the study of caste in politics and its legitimacy had to be argued for. Now, this arguing was done by eminent scholars like Rajni Kothari in a context where the study of social sciences was heavy with the dominance of the modernization theory. It is here that a sort of new conceptual category of the caste association gets introduced. And I argue that this conceptual move was responsible for the invention of an empirically incorrect distinction between regulatory or sanctimonious caste bodies on the one hand and political or mobilizational caste bodies on the other. Finally, in explaining why the caste panchayats and their role was relegated to the sociological and the anthropological life of caste, it gives us a scope to explore caste panchayats as a vehicle to study caste-based conservatism and how that is conserved by politics of the post-independent nation state through this interaction. It also reveals how post-independent state, in its attempt to democratize ameliorations on the basis of caste, creates what I call a new framework of caste governmentality. My first two claims, that is about the political sanction of caste panchayats over the social life of caste members, and the second claim about this invisibilizing of the caste panchayat as a category through which to study politics, sort of serve as premises that foreground my third and key claim about the present day motivations of caste conservatism in Indian politics and how the post-independence Indian polity has fostered it. So let me begin by speaking briefly about social ostracization, also called as social excommunication or social boycott. This is typically a form of punishment meted out to a member of one's own caste by a caste assembly for not adhering to the discipline of the caste. So if one really wishes to look at the traditional power of the caste panchayat, it is here in the power of enforcing social ostracization that one should look for it. In the Annihilation of Caste, Dr. Ambedkar writes about the power of social ostracization, and I quote, he says, now a caste has an unquestioned right to excommunicate any man who is guilty of breaking the rules of caste, and when it is realized that excommunication involves a complete cessation of social intercourse, it will be agreed that as a form of punishment, there is really little to choose between excommunication and death. No wonder individual Hindus have not had the courage to assert their independence by breaking the barriers of caste. So there's obviously a physical aspect to this ostracization, which means that one's touch may be considered polluting. No one is to visit the house of the ostracized. In many cases, the ostracized family is made to live outside the village or leave the village altogether. No daily provisions are sold to them, and no economic transactions are made. All this makes livelihood difficult in a tightly knit and interdependent village-based community. Yet, even as such livelihood dependence on caste relations has loosened, even in the rural context, what seems to have persisted, and this is reflected quite sharply in many cases that are registered against the caste panchayats, is a deep fear and a sort of debilitating effect of the social aspect of ostracization. This is so because such ostracization pushes the caste member to the margins of the group, where the member neither completely belongs to her own caste nor can she take up the membership of any other caste. This results in a complete and sudden loss of belonging. The group membership of the ostracized is put at abeyance. They are in a state where they have no place in the social scheme of things. This creates a very particular social situation for the ostracized, as there is no social life outside the caste in a caste universe. Especially establishing marriage relations becomes immensely difficult. So most individuals for whom their immediate life in their caste and community groups forms the only scale of their social experience, these episodes of ostracization can bring on a deep sense of indignity, extreme humiliation, and a loss of the sense of the self. Now, this method of social ostracization has been the most long-standing characteristic and tool of the intra-caste and inter-caste panchayats. Its legitimacy is deeply linked to ritualistic ideas of purity and pollution. I want to step back here a bit and say something about how this informs, or rather provides, a seemingly modest but in fact a very promising way of coming to grips with a long-standing debate in the sociological political scholarship on caste. This may be called the Dumo-Srinivas debate of the book view versus the field view. The issue that Srinivas and later Bernard Cohn and Nicholas Dux took with Dumo's view, which looked at caste as an unchanging ritual, was that caste must be understood and treated as a vast field of sociological reality, divorced from Brahminical Hinduism. There are, of course, nuances in the debate, where some historians like Sumit Guha argue that caste is political from the start. It's a rank boundary mechanism prevalent across South Asia, while some trace its secularization to the post-independent modernization when political caste or caste as a political category emerges. Cohn, Kothari, Seth, Rudolphs have made arguments to this effect. But a study of the caste panchayat focused on caste ostracization and its use by the religious authorities and the royals really establishes how these two aspects in fact feed each other. So the study of caste must be informed by looking at these two views not as a disjunction, but rather as a conjunction. The social tool has been in the past and continues to be used today to enforce political loyalty. So the empirical realities also support this. So in the Konkan region of Maharashtra, for example, there's a system of kaul, whereby members of a caste are made to take an oath to vote for a particular leader every election, and those who breach the oath are ostracized. Each caste does it to create a block of votes for their caste members, which is then used either to demand a ticket for their representatives from the caste, from a political party, or to make other demands with regard to government schemes, etc. Similar practices have been reported from Delhi and other parts of the country. There are many other instances from all over the country where the elected leaders and local officials have to fall in line with the caste panchayats if they do not wish to be ostracized. This is how caste panchayats use their social force to seek political compliance. However, this does not tell us anything beyond the local power of the caste elite and how that tries to control political decisions of its caste members. So from the perspective of the caste member, why does compliance to political decisions of caste panchayat gets observed unless the group as a whole has no political interest attached to these actions? Explaining this requires me to take a slight detour to say how caste panchayats have historically been organizing the navigation of political life of caste groups, and why is it that we have a complete invisibilizing of this role in the scholarly literature on caste. This brings me to my second claim. So in what form a caste group comes to be understood as having become secularized and thus performing political functions of registering itself in the census and seeking ameliorations on the basis of it in the colonial period play a very important role here. O'Malley, who was the Bengal gazetteer for the 1911 British census of India, noted 3 examples of this secularization. All these examples were from Bihar. So the first was of the Gwala caste panchayat, and this caste abolished 2 practices, the practice of infant marriage and the practice of women from the caste going to the market to sell milk. The second example he quotes is that of the Doshaha caste, which was described as a degrading, cultivating caste by Risley in 1891, who served as village watchmen. This caste had ruled for excommunicating its members who were caught stealing. The last and final example was that of the Saha caste panchayat, which had collected funds to send some students to Japan, its own caste students to Japan. Now, all these bodies were characteristic caste panchayats using primordial methods such as excommunication and loyalty enforcement. Yet, because of the functions they were performing, by employing these methods, O'Malley thought that these so-called degrading castes were finally modeling themselves after modern civilized Europeans. Now, moving forward to the 1960s, it was this very caste sabha that was characterized as the voluntary caste association in the scholarly literature without recognizing its continuity with the caste panchayats. A continuity which is established by one of the defining criteria of the caste panchayats, which is the traditional method that they employ to carry out functions which may be modern or traditional. So the assumptions of O'Malley were uncritically adopted by the scholarship because of their failure to get this defining criteria right. As a result, the term caste sabha came to be often used interchangeably with this new term, caste association. The Rudolphs in particular can be found using a confused defining criteria with further non-defining properties of these caste organizations. In fact, most caste bodies retained their legacy of non-voluntary methods of loyalty enforcement. This is the confusion of method and function that I'm suggesting gets the identification of these bodies wrong. It is a confusion of what defines and identifies the body with a further descriptive property of it that is not definitional. Now, these are really serious and eminent scholars. So what really motivates this inability to see caste panchayats for what they are? My reasoning that I produce in the book is as follows. As with many other subjects in the social sciences, the subject of caste was dominated for many years by what came to be known as the modernization theory. As is well known, this domination has been resisted by a wide range of scholars in the last few decades and from many different angles. On the subject of caste panchayats, however, even some who at times exposed the critical assumptions of modernization theory succumbed indirectly and in certain ways to some of its underlying assumptions, which blinded much of the commentary to loyalty enforcing character of caste panchayats. To briefly summarize, modernization theory took for granted that social and political change in nations such as India would undermine the primordial ties of caste. The liberal elaborations of such claims stressed on the emergence of political institutions, legal constitutional developments around formal democracy, and the increasing development of secularized education as the engines of change. More left-oriented elaborations stressed on the emergence of greater class solidarities as a result of industrial growth economies founded on what Marx had called primitive accumulation, which would destroy the traditional social ties of rural life. Much of the widely read scholarship on caste was dominated by the first of these elaborations, that is the liberal elaboration. And one strand within this liberal elaboration was represented by the early writings of Rajani Kothari, and the scholarship resisted the standard anthropological assumptions of dichotomy between society as a domain of tradition and polity as a domain of modernity, challenging it through empirical studies to demonstrate how the two were shaping each other. This had the effect of seeing caste hitherto viewed as purely social phenomena in more politicized terms. Another strand, though, to be found in the work of Susan and Lloyd Rudolph, who studied caste bodies' behavior from the period just before the British census, brought to center stage the category of caste associations conceived along Tocquevillian lines. Both Kothari and the Rudolphs went on to be quite critical of the modernization theory, but it is interesting that for all their repudiation of it, they retained an underlying modernist strain in the study of caste. The very idea of caste association was conceived on a more general modernist idea and ideal of voluntary associations. The Rudolphs actually and quite influentially read the idea of caste panchayats through the lens of such a notion of caste association. This, when combined with Kothari's emphasis on the political aspects of caste in a context of the emergence of late colonial political institutions and post-colonial secular developments, had a distorting effect on what came to be the prevalent understanding of caste panchayats. It led to the panchayat being considered political by virtue of its secular demands and efforts to secure Western education, higher economic and social status, and such for its caste members. It was seen as an institution of modernity. So the crucial point simply is this, that because of an easily exposed methodological slight, this evasion of the distinction between method and function, a great deal of the scholarship on caste has remained unaware of the enforcement of loyalty for political functions by caste panchayats. I now want to turn to arguing that caste and caste panchayats over the past many decades have indeed been entirely caught up in the politics of their time. And moreover, that the enforcement of caste loyalties is really perhaps nothing but the enforcement of political loyalties today. This requires a closer look at the developments of politics around caste in the post-colonial period. For some decades, even earlier, you have jati clusters that came to have a special kind of prominence in the politics after India gained independence from the British rule as a caste phenomenon. Jati clusters owe their origins to the formation of horizontal links between similar jatis in different regions of the country, seeking the advantage of greater numbers in the representational politics ushered in by India's newly formalized constitutional democracy. With such lateral affiliations, many caste panchayats and associations spanned multiple jatis and thereby acquired a wider range of powers to exert political influence. As is widely known, politics in India in the first few decades after independence was dominated by the Indian National Congress, whose dominance took a particular form that commentators have called the Congress system. As a consequence, the party had to be polycentric. It had to have one kind of rhetoric and one set of political pursuits at the central or the federal level, especially under Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, articulating a quasi-socialist emphasis on class-based politics. At the same time, because of the party's failure to carry out extensive land reforms, politics at the regional and local levels had to rely on mobilizations which were based on more traditional identities. Caste was thus given voice and extensive representation within Congress party through its regional political outposts, even if it went against the rhetoric of the center. The Congress party's dominance over the first 3 decades after independence depended on this polycentrism, which is a unique mix of progressive ideology and pluralism based on traditional ties in the region. So there's a progressive ideology which is being spoken of at the center, but you have a party which was based on traditional caste ties in its outpost. So it is at the regional and local levels that the local leaders of Jati clusters was central to what Congress system relied on in return for the largesse of political patronage that the party provided to these landed caste leaders, delivered through their influence over their members. In a 1962 reporting from the seminar held by the government of Maharashtra for the first batch of elected Panchayat leaders of the state, both from the Zilla Parishad and the Panchayat Samiti, which was the first set of elected rural leadership after the introduction of the Panchayat system in the state in 61. Siriskar, who interviewed these leaders, noted that caste panchayats continue to play an important role in the social political life of the rural community in Maharashtra. Over 10% of the sample are heads of existing caste panchayats, while 20.9% are active members of caste panchayats. He further observed that 68.6% did not respond to this question, perhaps indicating that they were being more discreet than frank about it. Fast forward to 2017, from over the 400 cases that were launched against caste panchayats in Maharashtra from just 3 districts, it was invariably found that in more than 1/3 of the cases, the head of the caste panchayat was also the sarpanch of the Panchayat Samiti or some other local level leader. Thus, there continues to be a high-level coinciding of interest in leadership and political activity between general panchayati politics of the village and the caste panchayat. So does this mean that nothing has changed in the sense that Louis Dumas thought of caste as this never-changing continuous system? Not really. I think it means 2 things. It means rather obviously that the very nature of modern democratic politics in India never shed the centrality of caste that both liberal and left versions of modernization theory had assumed would eventually occur. But it also brings to light a specific twist that modernization theory gets. And this is a modernist transformation of caste and religion into a set of political identities. In 1962, when Siriskar was writing, the social life of Jatis was politically framed in Jati clusters with caste leaders of the dominant castes in multiple horizontally affiliated Jatis, exerting their influence in the newly emerging democratic politics. But the caste elites who are exerting their power in 2017 are not from the same Jatis. They are not from dominant castes, but largely from what are called the OBCs, other backward classes, and the castes that fall under these. So the way they have been transformed into political identities is by a process of what I like to call caste governmentality. This change was brought about in interesting ways with a new politics of a political culture of benefits. There's a larger global background to it of the Second World War generating a new ideal in Western nations of providing social safety nets. The state became a site of dispensing welfare benefits of one kind or another. With time, socially disabled and historically oppressed categories were also brought under these policies. These ideas and ideals inevitably reach nation builders of colonized nations, and in India, historically oppressed castes, often categorized as depressed classes or scheduled castes and tribes, was an obvious category in the population who were granted constitutional protections and other guarantees due to the impressive advocacy of Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar. But this didn't really upset that upper caste dominance within the Congress, and the Jati cluster model persisted. What really seems to have changed this is the introduction of the Mandal Commission report. The Mandal Commission proposed a range of benefits for the OBCs because they comprised a majority of nation's population. A whole new kind of politics emerged, overturning the stranglehold of patron-client relations between caste leaders of Jati clusters and the Congress party of the early post-independence years. Specifically, the Commission's report resulted in a fragmenting of Jati clusters into single Jatis, since each Jati among this lower peasant and artisan population now sought to claim the benefits that accrued to them according to the state's list of OBCs targeted for such benefits. This had a very powerful effect on the enforcement of caste loyalties, and caste panchayats of single jatis returned with full force as active enforcers of caste identity, because in order to be eligible for benefits, one's caste identity could not be compromised or dispersed. The Commission called upon these voluntary caste bodies, that's the term that the Commission uses, to make their representations. The household and individual forms were filled under the supervision of these caste leaders. The deterrence through social boycotts of any transgression that might dissipate caste identity became central to this new politics of caste. Caste cluster, a particular caste cluster, I should say, in Maharashtra that has undergone this kind of fragmenting in the post-Mandal era, is Bhatke Vimukta, or the nomadic and denotified tribes, with particular castes such as Vanzaris getting themselves included in the OBC list through political mobilization forced by caste panchayat demands on political parties. The same caste in other regions, though, is making similar demands through their caste panchayats to be included as OBCs. We have such examples from across states and from across countries, with 9 state governments currently having filed petitions in Supreme Court to allow them to have a quota within the OBC fraction of reservations, so that they don't lose vote, given that the BJP really has now mastered the game of attracting these new OBC castes. So caste panchayats have thus become a disciplining body to bring the caste in line with state policies for welfare style benefits along affirmative action lines, and all political parties want to be cozy with them. So in a way, what the Mandal Commission did is that it introduced this Foucauldian politics that went hand in hand with endogamy preserving functions of caste panchayats, representing a whole new era of politics in India that emerged as a nationwide fallout from the path-breaking report of the Mandal Commission. The point here is this: these enforcements of caste loyalty by caste panchayats in the service of preserving caste identities for the past few decades are now almost wholly a political phenomenon. It is biopolitics. It is not primarily motivated by any ritual-based ideal of preserving caste status. The very idea of ritual purity and impurity, or sanctimonious regulation of caste members, is completely integrated with and entirely inseparable from the political mobilization for benefit of one's caste. The clean distinction sometimes made by social theorists of caste between regulative, sanctimonious, and political mobilizational in understanding of caste thus really now must be allowed to lapse. Caste panchayats function of enforcing loyalty to caste norms so as to ensure endogamy and preserve caste identity is predominantly motivated by the modern concern that benefits dispensed by state continue to accrue to the caste. This is so even as their methods for ensuring loyalty are entirely continuous with the methods of long historical standing. As a result, inquiry into the subject of caste can no longer be a sequestered pursuit of anthropology or sociology. The inquiry into caste is now an inquiry into the politics of a modern nation. So in conclusion, I would like to say that enforcement of loyalty to caste by caste panchayats has predominantly been driven by one or another form of politics that reflects what caste has become in India over the past century. It is a vivid case of primordial methods deployed in retaining age-old endogamist relations for ends that have emerged in a thoroughly modern form of democratic politics and social policy. belying ideas of how communities enmeshed in primordial ties disappeared with the consolidation of modern democracies, while revealing that what is retained in those primordial ties is nevertheless an essential part of modern democracy. That is to say, what gives caste panchayats their informal authority are often impeccably ameliorative ends for the caste in question. The larger conclusion that holds, of course, and I think it captures something fascinating, is this about the paradox of these relations between tradition and modernity in India. So I'll stop here and cede the floor to Srilata.
Thank you ever so much, Anagha, and I will invite Srilata now.
Thank you. Thanks, Louise. Do you hear me twice? Like, are there two? Okay, that's great. Right, so thank you very much, Anagha. I think you presented a very succinct yet detailed exposition of your arguments from the book. And I have very much enjoyed reading the book, and it has provoked a lot of thought and questioning for myself. So what I'm going to do right now is to first lay out some of my key observations, which I think are the main strengths of the arguments that you present and why they are really important in the context of the study of caste in contemporary India. And then from that, I'm going to segue into a few thematic questions, which I would like you to speak more about, that I think I didn't read enough about in the book. So I think this book is a really important contribution to the study of caste in India, because it does a few really important things that have been missing in that field of study so far. So one of the things it does is to squarely focus on institutions and mechanisms rather than on demographic groups or outcomes or statistics and effects of discrimination and such. So by highlighting the institutions and the mechanisms that have been overlooked in the study of caste politics and that are nonetheless omnipresent and extremely pervasive in the way caste operates in India today, or is made to operate, is enforced, I think it really highlights something that has been missing in the scholarship so far. And in that sense, it's a really important contribution. The second thing that the book does very well is to historicize and to show us in very concrete ways how these caste panchayats are not, a product of a particular turn in politics in post-colonial India, or it's not necessarily something that emerged out of Hindutva extremism and such, which I think sometimes the discussion of caste gets embroiled in. And it shows us this long historical trajectory from pre-colonial to colonial to post-colonial period in terms of how these bodies have evolved and changed and kind of adapted to the changing political and social setting to keep themselves relevant and to keep performing the function that they see themselves as performing in society. And that brings me to the third really important thing that I took away from your book, which is your focus on methods, which is a clear departure from using function as the defining category of what qualifies as a caste panchayat. So your focus on methods makes it really easy to see how the erstwhile scholarship, the debate between Dumont and Srinivas, and the scholarship of Rajni Kothari and Rudolph that you've referred to, really falls short in exposing the way caste panchayats have shaped both social organization of life, but also everyday politics and electoral politics. So I think these are really important contributions that I appreciate very much. I also wanted to note some of the examples through which you really make explicit some of these mechanisms that the caste panchayats use. For example, with reference to endogamy, in the chapter on endogamy, you talk about how the definition of gotras was expanded by the caste panchayat to include more number of groups that were forbidden from endogamous marriages in the light of the Hindu Inheritance Act. And you also talk about how the caste panchayats pushed for the imagination of the household to be extended to cover the entire village, so that the expropriation of labor from women in agricultural work could continue while their sexuality was simultaneously being governed and restrained. So these, I think, are really, concrete and thought-provoking examples that make your argument really strong and forceful. So thank you for that. I think I'm going to turn to my questions now. And my first question is about your views on the nature of the state in post-colonial India and what that means for the dialectical relationship between the caste panchayats and electoral politics that you write extensively about. So when you talk about the historicization part, you talk at length about the caste character of the state, both the Peshwa regime, but also the British colonial regime, and how it was in cahoots with Brahmin groups to produce a certain form of knowledge regime. But when we come to the post-colonial part, you talk about the Nehruvian modernism and kind of the welfare state emerging from that, and then you come to the neoliberal state. But I didn't read a lot about the caste character of the post-colonial Indian state. And this is a state that has consistently refused to carry out caste census, that has refused to recognize Dalit Muslims and Dalit Christians as legitimate recipients of affirmative action, that has recently taken away power from states to define what the other backward classes are going to be at the local level. So in the context of all of these things, how do you see the caste character of the post-colonial Indian state, and what does that do to shape the functioning of the caste panchayats?
Thank you very much, Srilata. If I could encourage members of the audience to post questions in the Q&A box, or just to say that you'd like to ask a question, because we do have the ability to actually allow you to speak, which is nice in this seminar. But I wanted to piggyback first on Srilata's comments to add a few of my own, if that's all right, Anagha, and then we might take a few from the audience and allow you to respond to those in the round, if that's all right. I wanted to pick up the kind of post-Mundell juncture, which you underline as having been important for the introduction of a new form of kind of caste governmentality. And what strikes me about, and thinking about it from the point of view of how the public distribution of welfare benefits changes at that point in time, and which other kinds of administrative categories come into play. So what strikes me about the Mundell moment is that it's also, of course, the onset of liberalisation, and with liberalisation comes a new discourse around targeting of welfare benefits more generally. And so you have, on the one hand, the expansion of affirmative action and reservations directed to the OBCs, but you also have coming into play new administrative categories, which are also used to target benefits. So I think particularly of the BPL category, but you also have the rise of attempts to do more to reach the elderly population, women, differentiation within the BPL category, so the introduction of Antyodaya category and so on. So there are all sorts of ways in which the population of beneficiaries is being defined and sliced in different ways. And I'm interested in what that does to the power of caste as a kind of organising mechanism of social and political life. So, to what extent does the introduction or the kind of hardening of a BPL category, for instance, cut across the social power of jati and the enforcing power of caste panchayats? And kind of linked to that question, and this may be something that you go into in more detail in the book, but I'm also interested to understand more how the enforcement of caste loyalty is used by jatis to secure benefits from the state. So is the enforcement used as an element of collective mobilization, in order to make collective representations to the state for the receipt of benefits? Or is this an attempt to uphold the centrality of caste as a kind of identity which can be used to make claims on the state? So it's a slightly wordy question, but is the enforcement of caste loyalty used to make direct claims on the state, so kind of quid pro quo direct exchanges with the state for the receipt of material benefits? Or is it more an attempt to underscore the endurance of caste as a form of claims making more generally? So those were my immediate questions, but I can see some more questions have come in the chat, including from one of your own students at the University of Hyderabad. In fact, I might invite you, Kabilan, to unmute yourself and ask your question directly. So hopefully this will allow you to talk. If you can, yes, you are, yes.
Thanks for this wonderful opportunity, Professor, and this is such a wonderful presentation. And my question is about the biopolitics, the emphasis you made on the enforcement by the caste panchayats. So my question was, like, in recent times, we see more honor killings, including killing or brutalizing of their own sons or daughters in public for their violation of caste purity. For example, an incident in Tamil Nadu, Kausalya and Shankar incident, which was like very much talked about. And she has become an anti-caste activist after that brutalization from her own parents. So can you talk about the emphasis on biopolitics you mentioned in your presentation? Like, can you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Thank you, and I just invite you to mute yourself. Anagha, if you'll bear with us, I have one more question from my colleague Kriti Kapila, and then I'll invite you to respond to this first round. And then I know Srilata also has a few more additional comments after that. So Kriti, let me give you the floor. That should allow you to unmute yourself now.
It has. Thanks, Louise. And thank you, Anagha. Am I visible? Sorry, am I audible? Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, sorry, I was muted, but okay. Yes, we can. Yes.
Sorry, okay. Well, thank you for that. I'm looking forward to reading your book. I'm afraid I haven't at this point. But I do have an interest in caste panchayats, and I'm an anthropologist, and I come to your presentation from that kind of disciplinary perspective. So I was quite intrigued by a use of what you called as the anthropological and the sociological life of caste, and you kind of had a I don't know what is meant by that. I'd be very curious to hear a bit more, and what it had to do with conservatism, that disciplinary perspective and conservatism, or maybe I misunderstood. But more kind of fundamentally, and I'm sure you do this in the book, but for the benefit of us who haven't read the book yet, could you please say what you mean by caste loyalty? What is it that you see these institutions enforcing when you say they enforce caste loyalty? Thanks.
Thanks, Kriti. So we will give the floor to you now, Anagha, to respond in the round to those comments.
Thank you for those questions. Thank you, Srilata, for reading the book. I hope it wasn't painful. So, right, about the relation to Hindutva, as you correctly pointed out, it's not that caste panchayats have some affinity to the Hindutva political ideology as such. Nevertheless, the politics of BJP, as I said, has cozied up very comfortably to the caste panchayats. They have replaced the Congress, and they have sort of mastered this game with these individual caste panchayats, as opposed to the Jati cluster model, of which Congress was sort of the master, if I may say so. But in terms of whether the ideology of Hindutva somehow entrenches caste panchayat activity further, I wouldn't be able to say much about it, because so far it doesn't seem like that. Moving on to your questions about the nature of the state, the post-colonial state, and the caste character of the post-colonial state. In the immediate post-colonial state, and I bring in the discussion with Partha Chatterjee and Pandian, I try to bring that in the book. There is this clear sort of blindness to caste that you do see in the immediate post-colonial state, as you have more and more, if I may call it, assertion, especially from the Dalit quarter in the initial years, especially Dalit Panthers, etc. You do have some public consciousness of caste, but it becomes a flashpoint during the Mandal Commission report and all the protests that happen and all of that. Nevertheless, I think the caste character of the state becomes visible in a different way, in the sense that the way the caste amelioration or empowerment, a word which is used often by the state, is imagined, is limited to this biopolitical way of approaching caste, right? And this sort of model of caste empowerment through affirmative action, which then works by biopolitically measuring these populations. So if you look at the Mandal Commission forms that have to be filled, the individual forms and the household forms, the questions that determine your social backwardness are, what are your roti-beti relations? Which means, with whom do you eat? Whom do you marry? It asks you, do other castes consider you as lower castes or not? And if, as a group, I know that how I answer these questions are going to determine whether I get affirmative action or not, then I'm going to make sure that, my group answers them in a way that the commission wants me to answer. And I've seen that a lot in the Maratha reservation activity, of which I was a part of the government of Maharashtra, Department of Social Justice. So I've seen that happen or sort of repeat again in that context. So the caste character of the state, in a way, looks at caste as this biopolitical category, which doesn't have to be challenged. The endogamy doesn't have to be challenged. And I think what that does is that it brings into an imminent tension this empowerment model with the goal of annihilation, right? So if you structure the imagination of, dealing with caste hierarchy in such a way that you retain endogamy, you retain this biopolitical category at the center of it, then it's always going to be in a constant tension with the idea of annihilation. And we see that sort of happening in the lower caste populations as well. So you have these vernacular histories being written of glory of the lower caste, traditions of the genealogy of these castes, who was this great ancestor, etc. You have these pride yatras, which are organized by the lower caste and the Brahmins. So the discourse then is set up in such a way that caste empowerment means caste pride. It means pride in this endogamous biopolitical category. And that puts it at a complete and constant, and if I may say, permanent tension with annihilation. So annihilation as a goal is not deferred, but it is made completely antagonistic to the way caste goals are imagined in this post-colonial nation state. And I think it is with neoliberalism, and it is interesting that the Mandal Commission report comes at the same time that you have the liberalization of the state, and that sort of creates this inevitable tension, and that seems to be uncritically internalized, not so much by the scholarship, but at least by these groups who are trying to resist the hierarchy. So I think that is what I would have to say about the nature of the state and how the state thinks, whether reflexively or non-reflexively, about these questions. Moving on to Louise's questions about new categories. Yeah, I think one thing that is really characteristic about caste is that affirmative action benefits are something that are only given on the basis of caste. So you don't get them on the basis of class, etc. But of course, welfare benefits, a lot of welfare benefits are universalized. They're moved out to other categories. So that I think does have an effect, that has an effect, especially at the village level, where you do see resistance to caste panchayat activity. But as I said, the social force of caste is still quite strong, and that doesn't really seem to operate. So a lot of these victims whom I met, who are quite well-to-do, they do not depend upon their caste members, or social, economically, etc. But they really do depend on them in terms of their social life. So at the individual level, that is what makes it really difficult. But at a larger level, I think what that does sort of do at the level of caste panchayats and the leaderships is that it pushes them further into this sort of competition. So these castes are put at in a situation of competition with each other, where more and more resources are not only being moved out to these other universal categories, but even in terms the opportunities which are available in terms of affirmative action, such as jobs, educational opportunities, etc., they're being privatized. So this sort of constriction, and now you have a new category, EWS, which has also come into the affirmative action resources. So that does sort of create a lot of competition within these castes, and then these castes mediate it not directly with the state, but through political parties. So it is the political parties that sort of patronize them. And they have dealings, they give candidates. It depends on who has given either more money to the caste panchayat leader or who has promised a ticket, etc. So there are a range of benefits. And then that's how it's not directly making a demand on the state, but it is mediating it through these political parties who are hands in gloves with these caste panchayats. So that's also why it's very difficult to punish them, to abolish them, etc. And a lot of resistance activity to the state also happens through caste panchayats. So if you look at the current farmers' protests, which is happening, they are organized on, so a lot of them are Jat caste panchayats who are at the center of it. And this is not the first time this is happening. During the Rajiv Gandhi era also, you have Tikayat and other leaders who are Jat panchayat leaders, and they were the ones who were challenging the state. But in terms of at the pan-India level, the Jats and Jat panchayats, I think, are in a lot of way very different. And I've tried to say that in the book, why that is so. The Jats have a very different history, etc. But at a pan-India level, there is this sort of constriction of the opportunities which are now available within the affirmative action bracket. And second, I think this sort of mediation through the political parties and their patronization of caste panchayats is how I think I would like to see that. I hope I've answered your question, but you can, of course, come back when we have the second round. Now, the question about biopolitics in terms of enforcement. So what I use the word biopolitics to say how there is this process of rational bureaucratization by which you measure the populations, you create categories and then you put them into it, but they are defined, as I said, by very biological categories of whom you marry, whom you eat with, etc. So these are endogamous categories. And in terms of enforcement, I talk of biopolitics in the book at the level of the state. So I'm saying that it is the state that is doing biopolitics, not the caste panchayats per se. The action of enforcement, and I think that connects to the next question about what does caste loyalty really mean. Now, loyalty is something, I think loyalty is a tricky concept. Loyalty is something that can't be purely rational. It requires pathos, but it also can't be enforced. So the reason why I use this adjective enforced loyalty is to sort of bring out the very paradox of how caste demands loyalty in this particular era, especially from their members who are not anymore completely dependent on them. And I think the enforcement that happens, of course, it happens because there are caste elites who have power, etc., but also because there's a lot of compliance. We are a largely conservative society, especially when it comes to restricting political and domestic lives of women. And that sort of aids. So the larger compliance of the society and the family, of course, aids why caste panchayats can enforce their will. It also affects a lot that you have a lot of social pressure on these families, on parents, etc., on why they act like this. So caste loyalty largely in the context of caste panchayats should be understood as enforced loyalty. It is not a voluntary loyalty. And that's why I think there's this complete tension between looking at these caste associations as voluntary caste associations. There is nothing voluntary about them. And the voluntariness is challenged at the social level, because especially women don't want to comply with these rules, but it is also the state that forces this loyalty on the members of the caste. The state forces you to identify as a particular caste category to be able to access certain resources of the state. So that's the dual way in which I think enforced loyalty works, and that's how I use the term caste loyalty. The last question about what do I mean by anthropological and sociological life of caste and conservatism. At least in the book, I reserve my comments on caste-based conservatism on this physical coercion of social ostracization and endogamy. So these are the two, in the second part of the book, I focus on these two aspects of conservatism and enforcement. And I use the term anthropological and sociological life of caste to speak to this division that appears to be very dominant when one is thinking about caste in the scholarship, that when we're speaking about the political aspects of caste, we want to look at vote shares, we want to look at which caste votes for whom, what are the factors, etc. But we don't want to look at how endogamy plays a role in that caste, how are endogamous relations enforced in them, how is ostracization working at the political level. So that's the sort of distinction that I'm making when I speak of the anthropological, sociological life of caste, and to say that this conservatism and its effects are not limited to that aspect of caste. it has sort of become enmeshed in the political, and it's the political study of caste that really reveals how caste conservatism works in the modern political context. So that's the sort of argument that I'm trying to make. Yeah.
Thank you. That was a remarkable set of responses to really wide-ranging set of questions. So thanks. Srilata, I wanted to invite you to come back in here, either to respond to Anagha there or to kind of go further on your initial comments. And just to also reiterate, if anyone else in the audience would like to ask a question, please do just put your hand up or signal in the Q&A.
Yeah, sure. I think picking up on the responses given by Anagha, I was reminded of another really succinct argument that she makes in the book, which is that caste panchayats are the institutions that provide the link between textual and ritual practice and state legislation and electoral politics and social life and social practice from a caste perspective. And then in the conclusion, she raises this question: can caste-based empowerment be achieved only by delaying the project of annihilation of caste, which you referred to also in your presentation? And in the conclusion, you say this question has been rendered rhetorical because of the political structures and the biopolitics of the state that caste panchayats currently operate within, which makes me question what are the possibilities for grassroots organization and grassroots movements and politicization. For example, you referred to Rakesh Tikait in the book as well as now, and his extremely conservative both like articulations and views that he holds on caste. And now he's one of the leading figures of the farmers movement. So we see these contradictions in many other settings as well. And to me, it sort of indicates that a strong anti-caste feminist political organization at the grassroots is the only kind of possibility that can negate this contradiction between caste-based empowerment and annihilation of caste. And I wonder what you have to offer on that.
I'm going to ask you to respond immediately because I think that's such a big question.
I wish I had an answer, but I think to give a dampened response from my training as a political scientist, I think one could think about it in terms of, Rawls's the RCD framework, right? The reasonable comprehensive doctrines. We can think about a consensus on what we agree on, what we not agree on, and sort of try and provide answers to what is our priority. So we could say that, we are not going to be purist on the grounds, and we're going to see what is it that we agree upon. And probably, and I am a believer in the fact that social movements are sites of public education. I think they do change people. So I hope that that becomes a way through which we sort of tide over at least the current stage in which we are stuck. So I think that's one way of thinking about it. But I think in the larger sort of sense, one really has to be able to push this sort of understanding. This paradox really has to be brought to the light, as at least of anti-caste thinkers, or as you said, feminist organizations, etc., so that they become aware of the fact that the way we are moving really doesn't seem to be taking us where we want to go. And I really don't know how that can be done, but I hope that this paradox really needs to be handled squarely, rather than just pointing out that to the fact that we have a caste hierarchy. Yes, we do have a caste hierarchy, but we also have a lot of intra-caste conservatism within all kinds of groups that really needs to be spoken up about. And I think that's probably a way to go ahead. But of course, I don't have an answer. I wish I did.
Thanks. Are there, yes, I was just inviting any other questions, but Kriti, if you'd like to respond, please do. Are you, oh, can you unmute yourself? I don't think I can.
All right, I have done it now. Great, this is all very, so much tech in the last while, it's amazing. Anyway, thank you, Anagha, for your response. I am, so I have a chapter on caste panchayats in my coming book, and that's actually making an exactly opposite argument to yours, because I guess I'm an anthropologist, and what I couldn't could I push you to spell out what is your position on Jumo? Because I think what you're saying, what you frame as conservatism, which I would never call it any. I mean, it's not about judgment whether we think this is liberatory or conservative, but what would you be able to say a little bit more about what you think is a difference between what you are saying and what Dumo's position on caste is, i.e. what you call it, the impossibility of annihilation because of the biopolitical conceptualization of caste, or biopolitics of caste by the current modern state. Actually, that's what Dumo is saying, that because kinship and caste are completely inseparable, you are never going to get, and that's why Ambedkar says you have to get away from that. So I don't understand. I'd like to understand from you what you mean, and I really still don't understand what you mean by loyalty. I understand what you mean by enforced loyalty or coercive loyalty, but I would like to hear, what is it one is being asked to be loyal about? Is it conduct? Is it vote? Is it voting patterns? Is it what is it, and why is it not compliance as opposed to loyalty?
I'm going to piggyback one more question, Anagha, as well, before I ask you to respond, which comes from Sunu Engineer. You're very welcome to ask this live, but actually you've written it in the chat, so let me just read it out. So, Anagha, you've mentioned that there's a difference between the Congress style of politics vis-a-vis caste and the current regime. Could you clarify or elaborate on what that difference is? And I think that is it at the moment for questions. So over to you.
All right. Okay, so first of all, on Dumo. So when I'm speaking of the book view versus the field view in my book, I'm taking up Dumo as someone who speaks about caste, as you said, kinship is caste, and caste is this unchanging ritual-based system that will not change unless kinship really becomes not based on endogamous relations. We do have kinship models in other states which are not based on endogamy, which work. So it's not necessarily kinship, but endogamous kinship. So what I'm trying to say is one cannot understand these relations as a disjunction. That's all I'm saying. I'm not saying that Dumo is right or Srinivas is right, etc. I'm trying to say that if you really want what the empirical relations between caste panchayats and the states and the caste panchayats themselves and the caste members and the caste panchayats at all these three levels give us a picture that there is conjunction. So why do I say that some part of Dumo applies to this? Because if you look at let's begin with the textual. So in the textual, you do have reference and mandate of caste panchayats in the Dharma Shastras and the Niti Shastras. You have them in historical records, etc. You have them on stone pillars from the Brahmaputra Valley to the Deccan. So all of that is one. Second, you also have Brahma Sabhas. So the earlier text would say that you should have Puga, Shreni, and Kula. These are the three courts. Kula is the caste court. Every caste should have their court and all of that. But what you have in the later part, and this is, so the model is that there is a Brahma Sabha, which is, or a Dharma Sabha, which is the body constituted by Brahmins and Brahmin gurus who are supposed to dictate how other caste panchayats will work. This does not find any mention in any of the texts, but it develops, it evolves over time. But what it does is that it goes back to the texts, it works with royal grants, etc. And it tries to bring in line all of these lower caste panchayats with the Brahmanical standard of what you should eat, how you should behave, how you should marry, and all of that. All right. So in that way, caste panchayats and their evolution have this idea of purity and pollution that comes from the Shastras. It has these practices which have come to them from the Brahmin Pandits and Gurus. To this day, there are caste panchayats which have caste gurus who come from Brahmin caste. There are tribal caste panchayats who hire a caste guru in order to adjudicate their conflicts. All right, so that aspect is very much there. But at the same time, as I said, the state is not absent. And other political institutions, if you want to call them political in the loose sense of the term, they are not absent. And this development, as I said, so the Brahma Sabha comes up completely in a relationship of conjunction with the royal courts. Then you have the Mughals who say, we don't want all these caste panchayats because they're a good source of revenue. You cannot adjudicate your domestic affairs by yourselves. We will do it for you and we will get the money. So what I'm trying to, and then when I speak about biopolitics and the modern state, I'm not bringing in Dumo there. So that's the, maybe I don't know if I miscommunicated that idea, but I'm initially setting up a stage where I want to be able to speak of caste as operating in conjunction and not in a relationship of disjunction. So that's my only issue with this sort of separation of the anthropological and sociological life of caste, where, you know, all these bodies like caste panchayats occur. And it's said that, you know, all of these aspects will go away once caste enters these politically modernized bodies of caste associations, etc. So I'm really fighting that when I'm arguing about this sort of disjunction. So I hope I made that clear. And when I use the word conservatism, I use it specifically, as I said, to speak about two things. One, enforced endogamy, and second, any thing that is done via the use of the methods of social ostracization. I call, in terms of my labeling, I call those activities as conservative activities. As I said, they can be used to get members to perform functions that are exemplary. You can enforce, and there are, as I said, there are examples. You can enforce social ostracization on members if they don't want to send their kids on a scholarship to study abroad. Nevertheless, it is enforced. So the method remains conservative, and I use conservative in that sense, wherein people, so the caste is using its social force to make people do what they probably don't want to do if there is no ostracization. So that's my use of conservatism there. To speak about loyalty, I'll try and do it as much as I can in this sort of setup. Loyalty, as I said, demands that we weigh it against our other commitments, right? So I try and understand loyalty as a commitment and not as compliance. And as I said, this commitment, when we speak of loyalty, cannot be completely rational. It also has to have something more. And loyalties are always, in a sense, relative. So I may be loyal to my nation and I may be loyal to my friend, but I hope that if both of them come in contradiction at some point of time, I'll choose my loyalty to my friend over my nation. So loyalty, I think, is relative, and I think it's a commitment. And how deep that commitment is defines, I think, the hierarchy of loyalties that we all have to have. And as I said, it's not completely rational, or our loyalties are not completely rational. I use caste loyalty in the context only of caste panchayats. And I say that the loyalties that caste panchayats demand are enforced loyalties, right? And what the state does is that it banks upon these already enforced loyalties, and it tries to build on that a biopolitical framework through which it then sort of accrues affirmative action and other welfare activities, etc. So I hope that sort of answers some of the questions that were raised. But I would love to read your chapter. There was one more question about what is the difference between the way Congress cultivated caste panchayats and the way BJP does it. I have to admit that I have studied in detail all of these activities till 2017-18. And that did not give me a lot of insight into how the BJP really works. But as I said, whereas the Congress worked with dominant caste panchayats of caste clusters, huge caste clusters, the BJP seems to be really catering individual caste panchayats and individual caste groups. As I said, in Maharashtra, they've done it with the Vanzaris, and I think there's a lot of excellent scholarship available on how BJP has managed to break the OBCs and sort of create. So to give an example, I think in Maharashtra, you have the Marathas, who constitute about 30% of the population. And of that, there's a considerable percentage of Kunbis who fall under the OBCs. Now, because these two formed a caste cluster and they were sort of loyal to the Congress for a very long time, politically loyal to the Congress, it was difficult to sort of break that caste cluster for a very long time. And then you have the Mandal Commission, and the Kunbis within this category get the OBC reservations in some regions. So what the BJP did is that in regions where these caste groups did not get reservation, they tried and cultivate the loyalty of these groups. So they tried to bring up leaders from these groups, gave them tickets. They also tried to bring in other OBCs who were not part of this cluster, and they gave leadership tickets, etc., to caste groups from these other OBC castes, which were smaller castes. And because we have there's an importance of block voting, they tried and cultivated the support of these smaller castes who were not in this big cluster, but still together they could make a lot of difference. So in Goa, they've done this quite well in some parts of Western Maharashtra. So the difference, I think, is that BJP understood that there are there is this fragmentation which is happening, that there is a lot of aspiration on the individual jati basis, and that can be cultivated, and that is happening at all levels. So if you look at the speeches that the Prime Minister delivers when he goes on election rallies especially, he makes sure that he knows what is the local deity of that place and of that caste, and he'll begin his speech by sort of paying respects to the particular deity of that particular caste, which is present, the population which is present in large numbers in those regions. So I think the difference is that BJP has sort of mastered this fragmentation of jati game quite well. So yeah.
On that note, which could set us off into another a whole other discussion, I think we will bring today's seminar to a close. It was a fantastically rich discussion, and we're really grateful to you for the time that you've taken, both to present your new book, but also to engage with us in discussion. So thank you from all of us, and I hope that we'll have more opportunities to continue this conversation over time. So that's it for today. We will have the recording of the seminar available, and I think available probably through our YouTube channel before too long. And we'll hope to see you all soon for our next seminar, which is, from memory, next week. So thanks for today, and until soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.